Thank you, Neera. So, yeah, as Neera said, I started Magic Bus 15 years ago, and it was really, for me, a journey more of accident and mistake. And I think I'm probably more confused now than I was 15 years ago. But I think, I had the benefit in many ways of coming from outside the sector. And, previous to my existence in the social sector, I used to run some businesses. And I think, coming in and sort of looking at solving a particular issue, and in those days we were looking at, how do we get young people into more meaningful existences? For me it was very apparent as an expat coming off a plane, landing in a city like Bombay, and you sort of see half the city living in poverty and literally half the city not living in poverty. It was, the aesthetic of that was very apparent. For me, I wanted to sort of try and understand why this happened in a country that I saw so many resources in. The accident happened in many ways because, when I started digging deeper into, why these particularly these young men that I was looking at and teaching rugby actually in those days from a street in Bombay, why they existed, why they lived like this, when the schools down the road were empty, that there seemed to be apparently a lot of services and resources and assets available to these young people, why they still chose to live on a street and live the life they did. And so for me it was a very personal journey of really digging deeper, really not understanding why this dichotomy existed. And I think today, even not just because time is short, but to skip forward, out of all of that lesson, all these lessons after the last 15 years, I think for me, and we talk about collaborative leadership, we talk about aggregation and consolidation in industry. For me, I don't think I can name one big issue that's been solved without collaboration. So if you look at the area that Magic Bus works in now, which is very clearly poverty alleviation, what I understand about poverty alleviation from people who are much more wise than I am is that you need many elements to happen all at once. There has to be an ecosystem in poverty alleviation. It actually doesn't make sense working on individual issues. So, if you talk to the experts, they'll tell you three things need to happen. That you need to be empowered in education, you need to be empowered in health, in gender. You need to have fair social systems. So it's really good if you have clean water, but if you're at the bottom of the caste system and you can't access the pump in the village, then it's all a waste of time. And finally, you need to have access to finance, to markets, to employment. And if those three things don't happen and don't all coexist in the same ecosystem, then you can't move people out of poverty. It's a fact. It's not certainly not something I've created. I think what's quite disturbing for me at the moment is that we're creating this sector of very fragmented small players, and in India we have 3.5 million non-profits at the moment. If you dig deeper, have I got time for this, or you want me to?
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So if you dig a bit deeper and you look at any one of those elements, and we work a lot across education, gender, and livelihood. We're definitely losing the battle on poverty. There's absolutely no, from a statistical perspective, there are 60 million more people living in poverty today than there were 20 years ago. So we're not winning. We have these 3.5 million actors, great government policy. You take something like education. We spend 65,000 crores a year on education as a government. We have nearly 1 million NGOs working in education. 98% of all children in India are within 2 kilometers from a school. Yeah? Yet 57% of all Indian children don't complete grade 8. So you see that dichotomy existing. So when you have isolation in a particular issue where you're not involving multiple actors in that, then actually you're perpetrating a problem rather than solving a problem. So, I can quote many examples of this as well within each of those verticals that you need to move out of poverty, but I think probably education is as good as any of them. Mm-hmm. So I would argue that it's not just about vertical aggregation and partnership, which is a fabulous model presented here. It's also a broader issue about partnering, creating ecosystems to solve something much larger than the issue you're dealing with, because they're all interdependent.
Yeah, thank you. And sort of speaking of interdependency, I know that's a big piece of what you're working in. Why don't you give us sort of your perspective, and then we can dive into specifics. Anish?
Yeah. Am I on? Yeah, okay. I've heard Arpan and Dinkar talk about the ecosystem, where they're talking about maternal and child health. I know the work of Magic Bus. And we've been looking at people who have been involved in the development sector. This I'm mentioning because this is a starting point of what my organization tries to do. At WCT, that's the Wildlife Conservation Trust, we allow the tiger to decide what the organization will do. And the tiger tells us that you work with communities. If you want to protect me, you can't protect me by guns, by putting more guards around my forests, or building a wall. You need to build a social fence around the tiger to be able to protect it. Why the tiger? When we're talking about, there are problems. I mean, from your presentation and what you're talking, millions of people out there. Why then an organization should put whatever money it puts in a field which is trying to protect animals that don't vote? Because when you don't vote, you don't have support. Well, no matter what happens, I can draw many graphs, but no graph will eventually say that tigers will vote one day. So I know it's not going to come that way. So, but then how does a tiger communicate to us? What is it telling us? All the issues that we have, poverty, inequity, social unrest, atrocities towards women, environmental issues, pollution, environment issues created out of the urge to develop faster than we are developing right now. They are all eventually byproduct of, and we believe, of environment degradation. And this is again not something that I have researched, but I've read. And the best answers come when you go back in time. And I'm not talking about 10 years, 20 years, I'm talking about 100 years. I'm talking about 200 years, I'm talking about thousands of years. And you see all those prospering civilizations at one point in time that were looking impregnable, disappeared. And it didn't happen because of a nuclear holocaust or something. It happened because they destroyed the environment around them. And that we have been studying since we were in 3rd grade. But somehow, the link doesn't continue to exist in our head. And we try to work on issues. And I'm not undermining the work that so many amazing organizations are doing today. But what I'm saying is the fabric of all that we do is hinged on how well we're going to take care of this planet. And tiger merely is the symbol of freedom. What does a tiger tell us? It tells us that I cannot live if there are no trees in the jungle. I cannot live if I don't have 50 square kilometers for myself, one animal. So it's a large ranging animal. It requires food, and its food feeds on the forests. And another thing that it tells us subtly, which is so important for us, is that if you protect the forest and the food out there, you will allow the ecosystem. Now we're talking about ecosystems. The larger than life ecosystem of this planet functions on those processes that are happening since millions of years. What is the lifespan of planet Earth? More than 4.6 billion years. When did life first happen on this planet? More than 3 billion years ago. We're talking about 3 billion years ago. When did the Homo sapiens, that is our species, evolve on this planet? Just 160,000 years ago. I talk about termites. You know that the termites have been on this planet for 600 million years. We have been here for 0.16 million years. And they are using technology like we do. They have incubators. Why have they not changed? If you take a DNA out of a termite and match it to a DNA of a termite, that's locked in some amber, which is millions of years old, there is hardly any difference. Why? Because they created an environment around them which they could control. We are exactly trying to do that. We are insulating ourselves from the vagaries of climate and so many other things, social, economic. But the termite teaches us that while they do that, they don't over-extract. And that's exactly what the tiger is also telling us. If you protect that ecosystem of the tiger, the byproduct from there is not measurable. And see, most of us, and even I'm sure there are people from the corporate world out here, people who have done immense amount of work with people. We are governed today by measurements. We want to measure everything and we say, okay, how many dollars of profit one organization is making, how much money we are making, how much impact we are causing, how many women we are impacting. Sadly, you cannot measure the ecological success so easily because there are millions of drivers that are working against and for each other. And so, we get embroiled by saying how many tigers does India have, and then we say, okay, 100 years ago there were 40,000 tigers in India. How many tigers do we have today? 1,700 tigers only, which is more than 50% of the global tiger population. So India should be happy. India has all the problems that you can think of on the planet, but it still has more than 50% of wild tigers on this planet. That way we are saying, okay, but then you go back 40 years ago when Project Tiger was launched, there were 1,700 tigers. And today, after 40 years, so many people like me who studied tigers became popular, famous. People make big money in the name of tiger, but it has not impacted the tiger really. Because they started working there was a big error. It was protectionism. There was no stakeholder involvement. People started protecting wildlife, keeping people out of it. It's not worked. You look at 40 years and millions of dollars have been pumped into it. It's not worked. I won't take too much more, but just maybe 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
2 minutes.
1 minute.
About
1 minute. Yes.
The water that comes out from there is feeding 600 rivers of India. And I'll just put statistics, people will understand it better. India was 23% thick jungles in 1914. This is 2014, and there is only 5% of that thick jungle that remains. The government figures for forest cover is about 20%, but that is, most of it is degraded. They don't talk about quality, and we're talking about an ecosystem. It functions only if all those components are intact, and that is less than 5% of India. 600 rivers are originating or are being fed by that 5% land. Whether you call it for the tiger, or you talk about the forest, or you talk about the communities of people that live there, unless we protect that chunk of India, we cannot live in a place like Bombay. Every single drop of water that you and I drink, whether it's in a bottled form or directly from a stream or from a borewell, is all a byproduct of a healthy ecosystem. And it's a tipping point. We can fight all these issues that we are talking about, but unless we take care of the larger picture, which is the environment, we are going to always spin in the negative direction, no matter how much of money we put into the systems. That's why this is what I wanted to communicate. And WCT is therefore working with all kinds of sectors. We are working with the government in a big way, because we cannot we can only supplement, we cannot start a parallel government. But when we work, we find so many good bureaucrats in the system. We find NGOs which are small, yet they are very effective. We find the line departments, the irrigation department, the education sector, the health sector, the rural development ministry, all of those, if we work for convergence, and that's what we are trying to do, is take help from people like them, NGOs who work for education, NGOs that work with health, NGOs that work on water, and we bring all of them together and say, let us put our best practices in the landscape that's going to support the rest of India.
Great. Great. Thank you. Thank you. So, Arpan, I'm going to ask you to move into the framework, which, and to just speak to a little bit of what Anish alluded to towards the end. You know, from the perspective of looking at sort of the three areas that you did, microfinance, HIV/AIDS, and polio, can you speak to which are the real critical stakeholders? You know, Anish sort of alluded to the government. But if you were to look at the government specifically and philanthropists sort of on almost different sides of the coin, who would you say is important and sort of why as we think about the ecosystem approach?
Well, I think you have to take a step back and say, look, what are we trying to address?
Yeah.
Right. We're trying to, when we looked at the ecosystem, what we said is how do we tackle society-wide challenges, right? Things that are, in a sense, epidemic or crises across India, whether it's natural resources, whether it's alleviating poverty. And so we looked at three. We looked at access to credit for the poor, right? As a sort of a non-healthcare analogy. We looked at HIV and we looked at polio. There was no way we could have tackled, as a society, any one of those without the government being involved, right? They have the bully pulpit, they have the largest share of purse, and they have the ability to sort of tackle these issues with resources in rural India, right, outside of the metros. So government plays a very fundamental role. You just can't tackle it without the government. Now you need instigators to move the government, perhaps in the right direction, to accelerate the government's movement, to find the right bureaucrats within the government to get them going. Those instigators many times come from the philanthropic world, whether it's a Gates Foundation, you know, which played a big role in HIV with Gavi, whether it's United Nations, in the case of polio played a large role. In microfinance, there were private philanthropists and grantees who played a role in getting funding to microfinance institutions so they could therefore get credit to others. So they both play a role. Now, in the case of RMNCH, the government actually has large funding institutions that sit there, but they work in their own silos, right? Sometimes cross purposes, but certainly not in the same direction. So there needs to be better coordination on the government in that part. In the case of RMNCH, this issue that Matthew spoke about, I think 3.5 million NGOs, actually applies greatly. There's something like 600,000 or 700,000. There's no accurate census of NGOs that are focused on this ecosystem. But most are subscale, right? Most don't have the skills. Most don't have the capital to go make impact at scale, right? And you need philanthropic capital and philanthropic talent to help them, to find the 200 or 300 that can really scale and drive impact. You need philanthropic capital to fill in the gaps on funding. So you saw in some of the examples that Dinkers talked about, that early stages before it's matured in society-wide ecosystems like this, philanthropic capital can serve as the accelerant to get things going, right? Not because it's this huge corpus of money, because it's money that can be targeted well, like in the case of Gavi in HIV. And so both play a role, right? But you cannot get there without government. You need philanthropic capital to serve as the accelerant to create the flywheel effect.
And do you agree, Matt? Do you agree with sort of what Arpan's saying? And if you can speak to a little bit about, you know, how much can the NGO really do? But I think, you know, from your perspective, Magic Bus has actually done quite a lot in terms of the ecosystem around.
Yeah, I think I just also just really interesting what Arpan's saying as well is that, you know, I think in the power politics of the 7 actors, which is really well detailed in your report, I think philanthropists hold the largest power base. I mean, you're quoting the Gates driving huge change in particular areas. And I think this is really where there's a huge play for people like yourself sitting in this room. Because I think, you know, actually a lot of this boils down to collaborative leadership. You know, and you know, in order to collaborate, you need to have great sensitivities around other organizations' cultures. You know, and I don't think in India we are well geared for collaboration and collaborative leadership, and specifically within the NGOs, and we can perhaps talk about that in a moment. But, you know, traditional models, you know, in your lives, you know, as you get more successful, you get more control over resources. You get, you know, you're measured by, you know, by that output. You know, in collaboration, I think, you know, the areas I've seen more successful is when, you know, you have people who have the ability to let go of those resources. You know, success is measured through less control and trust around those resources of other players in that. And I think, you know, in India we're really not doing a good job of collaborating, whether that's government, whether that's the NGO sector. It's so fragmented. You know, I've seen NGOs on a street fighting over a child, saying it's my child. No, your boundary stops here. It's my child. You know, it's and that's probably one of the worst examples. But you know, I think you know, NGOs by design are started by passionate, emotional people like myself who all think we have the best idea. You know, and you know, I think it's nice to start having this discussion, and maybe I think Dasra could play a very large part in collaborative leadership, actually, as part of some of the work that you do and are doing so well. But you know, I do start to see conversations, and I think that the philanthropists can really drive that conversation. You know, can make it a condition of partnership, because things won't work without collaboration. That's an absolute fact.
Do you agree, Arpan?
Yeah, I 100% agree. Look, in this RMNCH example, you know, we put up all the different parties. You can imagine a scenario where everybody's going in their own direction, right? With their own particular goals, right, and their own particular passions. But having this role of a coordinating body, not to say this coordinating bodies need to make decisions around everybody, at least sort of let's set a common set of goals, right? Let's go in the right direction. Let's at least coordinate government policy and government funding mechanisms. Let's have collaboration between the largest philanthropic organizations and government. Let's have some coordinating body in it. I think it's incredibly important if we're going to make a movement on this.
What do you think, Anish? Are there any coordinating bodies that you feel would help with conservation? I know in other countries, you know, having, you know, it's the top-down or bottom-up kind of perspective. What do
it's
you
more
think?
true in conservation than anything, because as I said, you can't measure many things here. Because there's so many drivers, everybody, they do something and can't say that because we did this, it happened, because there are 50 other things. So, philanthropists, again, I'm coming back to what they have touched upon, is why they are so important in the conservation sector is because India is about numbers. If you can't tackle numbers, and you can't have a horizontal as well as a vertical approach, you will not be able to make a difference. You can make difference sporadically, and India is more than 30 countries. It's not one country. So scalability that we keep talking about is not easy to do, and you need unconditional money for that. The moment most NGOs, I mean, I am talking about the well-meaning NGOs, there are quite a few. There is one NGO per 600 people in India. But there are many of those who are genuine. But because they are dependent on outside funding, they sometimes have to overcommit, come up with jazzy reports, hire people to create a report so that they can, not that they are not doing good work, but they try to maximize their outcomes on paper sometimes, more than in the field. Whereas a philanthropic organization, on the other hand, because, I mean, they eventually should also collaborate with other NGOs, high net worth individuals, international money, all that, but they have a buffer of their own money, which allows them to do things which are not in the first 5-6 years to pump in money without expecting returns. Now that luxury is not there in a country like us. And so that's why what philanthropists can bring to the table is not the amount of the volume. Volume, of course, they can and they should. But even if it's not volume, it's just that initial, and who are these people who are trying to make a difference in the developmental sector? Who are these young engineers, management trainees, all these guys who have gone to big institutes and trying to find out if they can work in the development sector? They are wanting a place where they can get their ideas out. Scalability will happen if the foundations are right.
Yeah.
And that's the key point here. And so philanthropy, therefore, it's not volume, but it's about allowing people, passionate people, and passionate people need to be left on their own. And
Sounds
for
scary.
that,
Just one other point, I would just make there on this philanthropy point is
Yeah.
it hasn't come up in our dialogue, but going forward, and almost everybody in this room, I suspect, could influence as a CSR, right? With the new CSR rules, can make a profound impact on any of these topics, including RM and CH. There's a substantial amount of money that's going to come available via the 2% rule. RM and CH is not really very high on the agenda in many cases, as high as it could be. And so it actually can play a trigger role. You still need the large philanthropic bodies that can invest sort of unrestrained for years on, as Anish saying. But CSR can play a huge role here. And I think more than just as much as anything, people in this room in corporate roles can have an influence on that. And that can serve as a trigger. It can serve as an accelerant. And it's in the interest of many corporations, right, to focus on this. And so we shouldn't leave that unmentioned.
Can you just wrap around the issue of being a trigger and the sort of contrast that Anish alluded to? Building a sense of urgency seems really important, right? And that might move the corporate into wanting to be in the space. But if you sort of reflect on what you presented, if you look at how long these particular sectors, 26 years, 30 years, it's almost like we're saying two different things. So can you speak a little bit to the contrast between urgency and the time that it takes, and how do you?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. These things do take time.
Yeah.
I think Anish or Matthew referred to the fact that, India is measured in billions, right? It takes 30 countries. It takes a very long time it takes time for the ecosystem to get going, to begin to drive impact. But I think, if you took the case of HIV or if you took the data on polio, you can see certain instances that if we did not act, right? And if we kept going at the trajectory we were on, it would have been a pandemic, right? And that became very clear. I think now our challenge in RMCH is we've had, as you saw the charts, we've made nice and steady progress over the last 25 years on most metrics related to maternity, mother's health, child mortality, other measures, right? We've made pretty steady progress. And when you talk about KPIs and metrics, when you report, mother mortality is declining 5% per year, child mortality is declining 3%, it feels pretty good, right? We're making progress, the money we're putting in. But then when you take a step back and say, look at the gap, right? The gap is huge. And actually, if you look at us relative to other developing nations, we're beginning to fall behind. And so you've got to, we have to create this sense of crisis. And I think it's there in some places. But this is why that awareness becomes so much more important, right? And that philanthropic bodies can play a role. But I think we have to recognize that we need to accelerate this, and it still will take the next 20 to 25 years to get to where we want. The disaster scenarios, if we kind of do status quo, we'll be looking at this type of gap and these type of issues over the next 50 years. And to Matthew's point, instead of being that sort of winning this battle, we'll be losing it, right?
What do you think, Matt?
I think it's also, I absolutely completely agree. And I think it's about the conversation you choose to have with the audience you're talking to, because I think you have to elevate. And, and I was just thinking, reflecting when you're talking then on the youth sector at the moment, which is Magic Bus's key focus. But, they've done a really good, that as a sector, they've started to really elevate the pitch in terms of looking at the demographic blip we have at the moment. 420 million Indians in 15 years will be unemployed or underemployed. 423 million. Wow. There has to be social unrest in India in the next 15 years if that figure holds good. But the impact of that has been to really, I think, catalyze both the government through NSDC and organizations. I think they spend about 2,000 crores in India, creating this private partnership, this ecosystem they're trying to create with industry. It's really been, I think, amazing how the corporate sector, with reasonable success, of course they need to do better, has actually started to get very concerned about their own value chain. Where are their customers going to be? Where are their employees going to be? So I think it's also about the conversation that you choose to have with the stakeholder that you want to have it with. So obviously you talking to a corporate about something that might happen in 35 years, he's not going to be interested. Talking about something that's going to impact him tomorrow about his customer base or his shareholder value or something that's going to actually impact him then, I think is the right conversation. So it's just about, I guess, the pitch and the conversation.
And Anish, how do you do it with wildlife? I think it's a challenging space for you because there's so many issues in the country. That how do you build that urgency versus everything else that's there?
Wildlife helps us to build urgency because they go and, if you protect wildlife, they spill out of the forest, they destroy crops, they attack people, and people understand that there is a problem. I walked into forests and actually entered a Shok Sabha where a young man had been ripped apart by a tiger. And this is an important thing that I'm saying here. And that's why there's so much hope in what we do as an organization. Think about us in Bombay, and you have a car that touches your car, and you'll have a traffic jam about a kilometer behind you because you will start arguing there. And here I'm entering, and there are women sitting, men standing, and I come in because I was with the forest department. We work very, very closely with around 83 national parks and sanctuaries of India. And there's a woman sitting next to this man, and he's a bread earner, and she's talking to him and saying that I told you not to go in the forest at 4:15 in the morning. He's not, and with me were forest department guys. What would you expect? You expect people to say, because of you, your tiger killed my son. And the village can pelt stones at them, but that was not happening there. They were not blaming the forest department. They are part of that ecosystem. So I was very touched. It really impacted me to see that there is a young man who's been taken apart here. And I went out and I told this forest guard, do you understand the kind of ecosystem that you are in and what magic you can do? You have only shown a stick to these people, and yet they are rational in their thoughts, even in such kind of situations. So they are part of, you have to utilize them. So riding the wave is what we do. And so what are we doing now? Simply, if you look at our website where we put on stuff, protection is one small section of what we do. Most of it is trying to mitigate man-animal conflict. Animals go out, you need to reach there on time, provide assistance to those people. Can't blame them for planting bajra outside a tiger reserve. Work with communities to make sure that they form cooperatives who will then put pressure on the gram panchayats, gram sabhas, make sure that when their budgeting is done, the government schemes that are there, and government has done fantastic stuff. There are at least 31 different schemes.
But you guys have done a lot for that to happen.
We are. So what we are trying to do is we are getting these guys together. They have ideas, but they don't know how to communicate those ideas. We just go there and play a catalytic role. And that one can do if we don't take credit for it. And that's why this NGO problem happens, because everybody wants to take credit. What we try to do is, and my chairman, Mr. Hemendra Kothari, told me the very first day that keep doing what you believe in without worrying about whether you see your name on newspapers every day. And now we are almost in the 6th year of the interventions that we're doing. And whenever I walk out into a place, I have people who come to us saying that, just because I'm wearing a t-shirt, they say, you guys actually paid for my son's education. And now he's working in Delhi and earning so much money. Now, those kind of things have started coming. Leveraging the government funds. Now the government has a lot of money, most of it goes back because they don't know where to spend. Somebody didn't do the right thing. A simple example, the forest department would come to us and say, in summer there is no water, and that's the reason why animals go out where the cultivation or the farmlands are, and that's where the conflict goes up. So they said, why don't you fund some bore wells, which will run on solar, which will cost about 5 lakh per bore well. It will supply water to those animals, so you have many such water holes inside the forest, so that will keep the animals inside. 5 lakh per bore well, you could do 20, and you could take care of this. Bore wells don't live forever, And borewells will supply water to animals, it will also provide water to cattle. And the conflict will start moving from the agricultural field into the forests. And you will have animals dying inside the forest then. So then we said, how do we do it? And this is too much money. India, I said, there are 663 national parks and sanctuaries in India. Okay? It's all about numbers again. So we said, that's not working. So we sat and I thought, all we are now doing is, we have shown the department to build underground dams with black cotton soil. There is water, thankfully there is good monsoon in India. All they have done is build those check dams. There is 7 or 8 feet, you dig, build, put check dams, that is black cotton soil. On the top you put just stones and mud and some wood.
Anish,
No, but
I
what,
need to open up for questions.
Yeah, you do that. But this is important because today they are recharging streams with 1/50th of the money that they were spending on building artificial water holes. By recharging those streams, there is water in the well in the village outside. And those are the kind of stuff that one can do and leverage. And the government has the power, they can get a JCB and do 50 such things in a way. And they have recharged so many streams in Maharashtra, in Vidarbha, where water is a big issue.
Great.
Malnourishment, all those things.
Okay, great. We're going to open it up for questions just in the few minutes that we have. I must thank Ajit that at every single day and every single session he is there for the first question. It's the Harvard Business School training, clearly.
Neera, that's the sweetest way of saying I'm full of it.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Arpan, last year you left us with the thoughts that there was a gap between funders, outcomes, and providers. You said not enough communication and not measuring outcomes correctly. Am I right?
Along
If
that
you
line,
remember.
yes.
Okay. You made a great presentation. And Professor Kash Rangan, who taught me this subject, every case ends up with all stakeholders have to sit together, work together, common vision, congruent action. वो पता है, हम देसी हमको सब पता है. And today also you've shown it again. But you got to be joking. 10, 15 organization governments sit together. राजा वो नहीं होगा इंडिया में. Okay? Here's on the stage, look at the diversity. You got numbers, he's doing it through tigers. That gentleman is doing it through playing rugby.
Ajit, I need a question because I have
The
10 minutes
question
left.
is it possible to build ecosystems, or do you just let India's diversity go and somehow it all comes together in the chaos? Do you force it, or
Matt.
do you let it evolve?
Matt, we'll do passion, voice of reason.
Well, we're losing. I mean, I think, as I said, we don't use rugby at Magic Bus. It's just so we're clear on that. But I tried, but they didn't want to play. So, but no, I think, as I said, in pretty much every large issue we've had to deal with, we're losing the battle. So by having laissez-faire and saying, look, let it be, and this very fateful attitude of saying it will sort itself out, it's not going to happen. The population is greater, 1.4 billion people in the next decade or so. I think there has to be. I don't know how realistic a 7-constituent approach is, as you rightly said. Getting 7 people in this country together and agreeing is a nightmare, and so I guess you find your own balance in that. But I would say that, and I'll give you an example of let me just think of an example of perhaps how, when you brought multi-stakeholders together, how that will work and impact change. And I don't know if any of you or many of you have been to Port Trust, the Port Trust slum. It's a slum which is probably about 5 kilometers from where we sit here. There are 400,000 people that live in Port Trust. It's an illegal slum, therefore so the government doesn't allow schools, it doesn't allow sanitation, it doesn't allow electricity, there's no hospitals. It's like living from my country, it's like living in 200, 300 years ago. And I've taken experts to that slum from the United Nations, from other organizations that have said this is the worst urban poverty we've ever seen in our lives. And this is 5 kilometers from where we sit in the Taj. When we went into that community, 20% of the school children went to school. There's no schools. Now, I think just through catalyzing relationships, and so we started working with the government, we started working with a big fund, I'll name that funder is ICICI, and most importantly started working with the constituents. So the thing about poverty and why it's so insipid is that there's no cohesion, and unless you put people together, nothing's going to change. Any person that challenges 100 angry women from Dharavi, I will give them a medal. I'll give your medal to them. because when you get people together and you make that cohesive and that collaborative, things then start changing. Today in Port Trust, now 89% of all children now go to school. It's not just because of Magic Bus, but it's because we've managed to we had this great program. I just have to tell you this because it's about adolescent girls, and it is just very relevant to this. But, at puberty in India, all this is wonderful, but you cannot get girls to come out and participate in pretty much any program whatsoever. So in this particular program, we started a football club for parents, for the mothers. So we got this great football league running in Port Trust. The grandmothers then said, we've never done this before, we want to also start. So we started a grandmothers league and the change was that we said that the daughters had to be the coaches of those teams. So we've actually changed the whole paradigm of how women are viewed, but that took cohesion, not necessarily driven by us, but driven by the community. And I think it would be impossible to solve things without multiple actors coming together.
Great. Let's take another question. Good answer. Yes, thank you.
Sure. My name is Mary Stricker, and I'm here on behalf of Parivar. I have a question regarding, and I've dedicated my life to the nonprofit sector, so this is not meant to be inflammatory in any way. But I do wonder what the panel's thoughts are on NGOs being the primary service providers to a population. I mean, ecosystem, great, collaboration, great. But beneficiaries can't vote out their NGO. They can sort of indirectly by not using services. But, ultimately, do we want a population to depend primarily on its government?
Okay, yeah. Arpan, I'm going to have you take that question specifically.
Okay. Look, I think there's no doubt that we probably have too many NGOs, too many unqualified NGOs, in some sense, in India. And I think if we're going to make impact, that we need to actually change the complexion of that, right? We need probably fewer NGOs that have more capability and a greater ability to scale and drive the type of impacts you want because they have the right talent, the right resources. And look, I think your second part of your question is, should they rely more on government to do this? And I think we have to recognize that the reach, and there's limitations in terms of the reach of the government, the resources of the government, and the talent of the government. So sort of substituting one for the other probably isn't the right balance. It's probably a little bit more of how do we change sort of the complexions of the type of NGOs we have in the country and drive them to create a different scale and complement what the government does. I think they both have to exist. It's just, I don't see a scenario in which that changes.
Yes, let's take the next question.
Hi, Matthew. My name is Pooja Kapoor. I run a social initiative called Towards a Special Cause. I was really inspired by hearing what you did with the Port Trust habitat. Now, just to understand, was there any kind of opposition, since you said the government, it's an illegal sort of community there? After what you did, it should have been so inspiring, and I mean, if that could be replicated across Mumbai, that would make a huge difference. So, did you?
Yeah, so Port Trust is, again, I'd really ask everyone to have a look at Port Trust because it is just an amazing, we're in this incredible city with just this, this anomaly of Port Trust. But Port Trust is still an illegal piece of land. So the Port Trust will not invest any infrastructure. They won't build schools, hospitals, etc. So we're kind of working on an assumption there that how do we access children, I hate to use this, but on buses to the schools, and how do we make those more accessible? So we're not being able to build schools on that. But I think my lesson in this, and I think we make so many assumptions about the poor. And I hate using this word empower, but generally speaking, my experience, and we're in 4,000 communities across India, is that they'll come up with the solution, and I think you've got to let go at some point, and that will determine what's a good or a bad NGO, by the way, is how much, this rights-based approach and how much people within that community own that program. And I think that's the silver bullet, is is that, you have to take this shift away from being a service provider to being someone who enables.
And that's probably
Thanks
critical.
so much.
Thank you. That's probably critical, Anish, from
Yeah.
your perspective. Do you want to speak to that a little?
Yeah, see, a little bit to what you were asking. NGOs' role will be to make the government more accountable. That's an important role. And the traction you will get when you work with the communities, you'll get their vote. And I've sat in a lot of meetings with the collector's office, with people from 6 Gram Sabhas there, and some 200 people talking about, somebody talking about electricity, somebody talking about. Just one NGO anchoring everything so that the government understands what the people are saying and translate what the government is trying to tell people. Because most of these meetings, and you were right, that it's not easy to put all these people together, but the NGO can play the role of smoothing up the process if they understand it. And the most important thing is to not become personal. Let the people take the decision, because that is your first step for exit. If you can't exit a particular issue, then you are not successful at all. So unless you build capacities in them and make them take the right decisions, what is right for them, not what I want. That's I think is the solution to all this.
Great. Yes, we have one last question. Yes.
I'm Radhika Rajan. I'm with DSP Investments. My question is really to Matt when you're talking about the Port Trust, and perhaps I don't understand exactly what the situation is, but if it's an illegal settlement and you're providing services which the government won't provide because it's illegal, by enabling those services in some way or the other, what's the direction? Are you basically saying that they're going to be legally entitled to stay there, or, and doesn't it sort of create a situation where therefore groups of people can sort of take over anything and say, okay, ultimately this will become?
Really good question. Actually today we have a meeting with the Port Trust, so it all becomes part of the ecosystem about the lobbying of, because you're absolutely right. I mean, what are you encouraging? And it is not their land, and that it's the first point of entry for anyone migrating with no money into Bombay. They come to the port, and and the Port Trust have a valid point perhaps to say that this shouldn't exist. So I think it is, just from my perspective, it is, you want to work within the framework of the law and the government. They are obviously a crucial element to this. But I like that point about, one of the roles I think of an NGO is to lobby, is to advocate where you see injustice and something that's not working correctly, which isn't the case here, because where do you put those 400,000 people? That's a lot of people, who now own their livelihoods. It's a huge economy in Port Trust now.
But in effect, you're actually being very capitalist, because you're giving people, rights to land and so on and so forth, which in a way they just seized. I mean, this is not to discount that they're indigent and, the city, owes them something, but it's basically you're allowing a kind of usurping.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're not, of course, but I
when
think
I say I just meant
yeah. So I just think, but I mean, so when I look out of my window in Parel where I live, I see Port Trust and I see the inhumanity and the suffering, and that for me, I think, is a reason to do it. Now you can dig, and I think this is the ecosystem discussion that we had at the very beginning about involving government, involving our larger systems than your own, and I think there's a short-term, the fear issue of having to deal with some of it. It's just unbelievable when you walk through the streets of Port Trust, and people shouldn't live like that. And then you perhaps deal with that first and foremost, and then of course there's the longer-term issue of understand the legal. Should they go and live in New Bombay, and are you perpetrating a problem? Yeah, I completely think that's a valid discussion.
And a much larger discussion. So thank you so much for all of your thoughts. I want to leave you just with 2 key takeaways from this session, if you can reflect on, and we're going to move into tea and coffee. I think one important thing is that the role of the nonprofit in this ecosystem is critical in actually bringing in different stakeholders. And to be able to enable that, we do need funding. And philanthropists have typically not provided the advocacy and the lobbying requirements as much as we need it. So we hope that this ecosystem approach that we've presented to you will allow you to see the importance of that kind of funding, is the first thing. I think the second thing is there is a sense of urgency. There is a sense of urgency in where we are in the country on a number of different issues. But I think balance that with the fact that it takes time for impact to happen. And so I think if you see those two pieces and participate, but also allow the work and the impact to continue, we really think we can make a difference. So thank you very much, and we
Can I
can,
just have
yes.
the last word, because I don't know if this is apparent, but I just wanted to say also, just from Magic Bus's perspective, you know, we are here, I'm on this platform today, we have one of the larger NGOs in India. It's because DUSRA gave us our first seed capital. I just want to recognize you guys on, no, they came along 15 years ago and said, we recognize this idea, and they gave me a grant, which I wasn't allowed to spend on program money. What an amazing grant. You have to, this is your office expenses, your phone calls, your, an amazing foresight, and that's the impact of DUSRA, so thank you guys.